Hey guys, Despoiler Magic here, and it's finally time to show off another deck that I created. I like this one because it's a hell of a lot cheaper than Crypto White, which is at least 150 I think at this point. And honestly, this deck is about on par with it difficulty-wise. I think I won and lost about the same amount of games with this deck. And if you're a Control player and you've noticed that Control is pretty much dead and buried with the latest set, well, this isn't exactly the Theros block, but it's still a pretty good, fun, powerful Control deck. The first thing to keep in mind is that this deck has 23 creatures and 15 non-creature spells, which is right around the number that you want to have. If you gotta do some damage at a reasonable rate, that's usually the mistake people make with Control decks is they forget to put enough aggro to actually win the game, and then before they know it, they're top decking and they lose. Thus the 23 creatures, and they're all pretty hard hitters too. And 15 spells is exactly 1 in 4 cards in your deck, and with scrying it's gonna feel like it's a little bit more. So unsurprisingly, the one creature in the deck that is going to piss people off because it costs a fortune is Thing in the Ice, and there are 4 of them. This is basically a Thing in the Ice deck. So you can't really swap it out with anything without, logically removing half the deck. Now, if you haven't been paying attention, though, I will remind you that as of right this second, you can get 4 of them online for just under $20. So that's less than $5 per Thing in the Ice. That's not that bad. I mean, it's not what I would call a budget deck, but $20 for a set of really expensive creatures, or formerly expensive creatures, I should say, is pretty good. And remember, you can always trade for them, of course. The next creature is Aberrant Researcher, which of course flips into Perfected form. Now, both of them are extremely powerful, high-damaging flying creatures, so whether it flips or not, it's a really good creature. If you can make sure that the next card on top of your library is a non-creature spell, you will automatically flip Perfected, and this deck has a couple ways to do that. But it's not very necessary, and without Perfected on the field, you would simply make sure that a non-creature spell gets drawn into your hand if, 1, you need removal or counter spells, or 2, you just really want to trigger Thing in the Ice, or both. Now, you might have noticed that Perfected form, and only Perfected form, is a horror. That is the theme of this deck. And why is that? There's no tribal bonus for horrors. Well, of course, it's because Thing in the Ice doesn't remove horrors from the battlefield. So if you get it to flip, it's usually game over on that swing because you'll have 3 or 4 creatures all swinging, all with high attack power. Next up, from way back in Magic Origins, we've got Despoiler of Souls, formerly an expensive card, but not anymore. Now this 3/1 can't block, but it does only cost 2, which of course is double black, so not always available, but it is doable. Well, you might have already noticed it's a horror, so that is not exclusive to Shadows over Innistrad. There was one other horror, and you're looking at it. Now the fun part is you pay 2, exile 2 other creature cards from your own graveyard, and then return Despoiler of Souls directly to the battlefield, not even tapped. Obviously, you can't do this as an ambush block because it can't block, and that's actually the reason it can't block. But 3 damage when you can just suicide swing almost every turn is amazing, because you're probably going to force them to lose a creature blocking, and then you just bring it back and do it again. And as you'll see shortly, this deck has no problem putting creature cards, or really cards in general, into the graveyard. Next up, we got a fun control card called Stitch Mangler. It's a zombie and a horror, and zombie is of course important. It's only a 2/3 for 3, but when it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped, but then it also taps a target creature an opponent controls, and then that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So it's a good stall while you use scrying to go get a kill spell on something just outrageously huge that you can't handle. I use this to fend off a Void Winnower, I've used it against Ulamog, I've used it against large defenders to win on the swing. I mean, it's just a great utility card, and it's an alright amount of aggro. Plus, it's both a zombie and a horror, which is incredibly important to this deck. Next up, we've got Forgotten Creation, also a zombie, also a horror. It has Skulk, which is amazing being a 3/3, so the 4 cost doesn't matter at all. And it says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may discard all the cards in your hand. If you do, draw that many cards. Not, hey, pay 3 to do this, not reveal a bunch of cards from your library, not, only do it under this condition, and not draw that many -1. If this creature is on the battlefield, you can cycle your entire hand every single upkeep, which of course could put a whole bunch of specific cards into the graveyard, like for example creatures. And did I mention a 3/3 with Skulk is amazing? And next up, well, you know it wouldn't be a zombie horror deck without the king zombie horror himself, Geralf's masterpiece. Geralf has a history of making some cards that are unbelievable, like Geralf's Messenger, and this time is no exception. You get a 7/7 flyer for 5. It is one of the most powerful blue creatures ever printed, all things considered. It's basically Nixithid in blue form and in standard, except more control over it. I've noticed that by the time you have the mana to get this card out and by the time it shows up in your hand, he typically will have either a 5/5, 6/6, or 7/7 stats. Mostly because there's not a whole lot of draw in this deck. In fact, there's none. That much damage in the air, it's practically unstoppable, especially when you can protect him with counterspells. Then the best thing is, for 4 mana, you can discard 3 cards, which is a little rough late in the game. Return Geralf's Masterpiece from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So you still can't ambush block, but he's there. If you start losing the game and they thought they finally got rid of him, just hoard cards, pay 4, bring him right back out. And finally, bringing up the tail end of the creatures, and this is the reason the creature count is so high, I don't really even consider this a creature, it's basically an enchantment. It's Sigiled Starfish, the card that was so good they upgraded it from a common to an uncommon when they reprinted it. The power of this card cannot be overstated, it is incredible. You've got a 3 toughness blocker on turn 2, and then whenever you want, you can scry 1. Not only can you scry 1 during your opponent's end step, which is the normal type, but if you really didn't get what you wanted, you can also scry during the beginning of your upkeep prior to your draw step. If you get 2 of these non-legendary starfish out, you can do it twice, or, effectively, 4 times. Then if you had to bury 4 cards because all 4 of the scries failed, you get a 5th shot at the card you want. That's 5 cards out of, well, 60, but not really. At that point in the game, it's probably 45. You're almost guaranteed to pull at least the type of card you were looking for. And you can do this for free with no negative consequences. You could also use it as a chump blocker in case of emergencies, and then in response to selecting it as a blocker, immediately scry 1, and then it's still considered blocking even though it's tapped. You can use this to artificially flip into perfected form off of Aberrant Researcher. You can use it to go find a kill spell or a counter spell that you badly need, or some of the other important spells, or you could just go get Geralf's Masterpiece or a Thing in the Ice. Either that or just simply avoid drawing lands. Whatever you see, if you don't like it, you bury it, and it just works perfectly. Moving on to the non-creature spells, we start with the reason that this is also a zombies deck. Well, mostly coincidence, but also because it's compelling deterrence. For 2 mana as an instant, which is very nice, you can return any non-land permanent to its owner's hand. That's artifacts, enchantments, equipment, auras, whatever you want. Then, that player discards a card if you control a zombie. Now, most of the creatures in this deck are zombies, so it's a pretty good chance. Now, if somebody just brought out an 8/8 octopus token, and then you decided to bounce it back to, quote, hand, and then it immediately dissolves, then they have 1 card in hand, but you have a zombie on the field, they now have to discard that card. The only problem is, if you're trying to save your Geralf's Masterpiece with compelling deterrence, you might end up discarding a card, because you're trying to save them from getting killed by bouncing them back to hand on top of the stack. So a little bit of a downside there, but, you know, it isn't typically necessary to do that. Next up, we've got Scatter to the Winds. It's basically a cancel with Awaken, and yes, you do occasionally use Awaken, because this is a 22 land deck, so it's very possible that you'll get to 6, and you might not have a better use for the mana at the time. Unfortunately, it's only a 3/3 land, but for 6 mana, that's pretty reasonable, considering you also just shut down whatever they were doing. Plus, the artwork is totally amazing. Next up, we've got Ultimate Price, which this card keeps burning me, so you might want to maybe replace it with Ruinous Path. It costs 1 more, and it's a sorcery, which is really rough, but it will kill colorless and multicolored creatures, whereas Ultimate Price will not. You can't blow up gold cards, and you can't blow up colorless Eldrazi, or anything else colorless, like an artifact creature, so it keeps coming up, but for 2 as an instant, I would at least mainboard it, and then maybe put Ruinous Path in the sideboard, since Ruinous Path can also take out a Planeswalker. And finally, we have the rather strange addition of Broken Concentration. You may have noticed that the card Cancel is not actually legal. The last time it was printed was Khans of Tarkir, so we actually cannot throw Cancel in the deck. So don't just grab one off your pile of cancels and assume it's going to be legal forever, because it isn't. With the pathetic state of counterspells in blue right now, in Standard at least, We're lucky we even have a negate. I mean, all the staples are gone, replaced with 1 or 2 mana more expensive garbage. So besides basically being a cancel, I don't understand the point of this card. At all. Let's talk about that madness cost of 4 for a second. If an opponent is casting a spell that's making you discard it, why wouldn't you just pay 3 as an instant and cancel the spell, or cancel the summoning of the creature with the ETB effect that does that? There is literally no reason to pay 4 under that circumstance. If you are the one forcing yourself to discard it because of like a vampire or something like that, what the heck are you canceling then? What would be the target? Your own spell? This is quite possibly the stupidest card in Shadows over Innistrad, although I feel like maybe there's a couple that are at least tied. So yeah, just close your eyes and pretend it says cancel on the top. Now, there was another counterspell that costs 3 that lets you scry 2 with Spell Mastery, but it only increases the cost of the spell by 3. So, with how long this tends to drag out the games and a lot of the land dump decks out there and mana ramp, I wouldn't. I don't think 3 is good enough to say, yes, it is definitely canceled. It's just not worth the scry 2 when you have other ways of scrying. And, of course, the lands are no surprise. 4 copies of Sunken Hollow, the double-check land from BFZ. Then, of course, you've got either Submerged Boneyard, if you want to save a little bit of money, or Choked Estuary, which at this point is probably about $250 to $350, so not the biggest, most expensive land. Not exactly a fetch land. Both Sunken and Choked will give you 1 out where it may not come in tapped, so it's obviously better. And then I put in 2 copies of Evolving Wilds just because in 2-color decks I like to have 10 ways to fix the colors. Then, of course, there's 6 swamps, 6 islands. You might be able to mess with those numbers a little bit, but there's a lot of double black and a lot of double blue, especially if you go with Ruinous Path, which is also double black. So play around with the lands. With this configuration, I had absolutely no problem with getting mana screwed in any game ever. And if you're watching the 10,000 subscriber special, you saw me use this deck a whole bunch, and it did tend to work. As for the sideboard, this practically doesn't need a sideboard. I mean, if they're rushing with werewolves, you might want to put in Rancid Rats. It's a 2-cost, 1/1 Death Touch rat with Skulk. So Death Touch is always fun, and then Skulk is hilarious because they usually just can't block it, so it's almost a 1 guaranteed damage. And then also he's a huge attack deterrent, so it's a good card. It actually almost made the deck, and it's also a zombie. Now, if you keep running into like Center Soul and I guess Ultimate Price, you could take out Aberrant Researcher and throw in the Thraben Gargoyle, which is really similar but a 2/2 defender instead of a 3/2 flyer before it flips. And all you have to do to flip it is pay 6, which is very reasonable. And then it's actually a horror, believe it or not, the only colorless horror that's in Standard. You could always throw in Sanitarium Skeleton if they tend to have a whole bunch of creature removal. Otherwise, Relentless Dead if you've got just piles of money just sitting around doing nothing. And if you really know that they're going to cast a lot of non-creature stuff like Planeswalkers, definitely throw Negate in there. I would always have Negate in the sideboard. Ruinous Path is always good in case there's Planeswalkers. And you can mess around with, the counter spells. You can, up the cost with that, 1x one that's basically a Syncopate clone. Or if you know your opponent's going to have a lot of Enter the Battlefield effects, you could put in the mother of all cards, one of my all-time favorite cards. It's so funny. Mirror Mockery. Oh my gosh, do I love this card. The exact text on the card reads, your opponent is screwed and can't attack with anything ever, especially if they have a creature with a really strong Enter the Battlefield effect. And of course, if you built a deck that has a high Enter the Battlefield trigger count, you could put this on your own creature. It doesn't gain haste, remember that, but you'll still get another instance of it entering the battlefield. So in general, this deck tends to just get exactly what it needs out of the deck with Scry, so it's really, really consistent. But there is no one central win condition like some more modern-ish decks that are running Thing in the Ice, where they absolutely have to get it out and then absolutely have to trigger it or they lose. You could go an entire game without Thing in the Ice coming out and have no problem winning, especially with the volume of Flyers, Skulk, and possibly Death Touch depending upon how you built it. If something looks like it's going to be able to block you, or if you've got a giant 10-countered Tireless Tracker on the field, you start removing it by bouncing it back to hand and removing all the counters, auras, and everything else, or just outright killing it with Ultimate Price. Everything else, you counter it in the first place, so you can just sit there with a 3/2 flyer and do nothing but hold 2 counter spells and a full line of lands untapped, so no matter what they do, the next 2 spells are dead. And you just watch your life total melt away. You could use Forgotten Creation to stuff the entire graveyard full of creatures and then bring back Despoiler of Souls so many times that they run out of blockers or run out of life points. And of course, Geralf's Masterpiece is one of the most powerful creatures ever made, so it's just fun to get to play with him. Especially when he keeps coming back out of the graveyard. Oh, did I mention that the Sigiled Starfish is the greatest thing ever? This deck is just so much fun to run. It's probably not the absolute strongest deck, just crushing combos that nobody can deal with and just speed, but it's like a traditional bread and butter, but really high combo black-blue control deck. It uses all the super weapons like Thing in the Ice, Perfected Form, Geralf's Masterpiece, and the control spells are some of the more fun ones that they've printed recently, so I would just recommend this deck to anybody. It probably is under 50 to build it, probably even like 40. I mean, the lands will probably bring it up to 50, but it's cheap-ish. I'd call it like a mid-range price deck. I mean, Werewolves is definitely cheaper, but this is a lot more fun. So if you've got the cards already, you got most of these cards, which almost all of them are actually uncommons, and the ones that are rare or mythic are dirt cheap rares and mythics, except for Thing in the Ice. I would definitely recommend building it and testing it out. Of course, you can always build it for free on Xmage, which is like the sort of free alternative to MTGO. It's a little glitchy and it's a little weird. There's not that many players, but it worked for the tournament, and it was a riot. And I test all my decks and then buy them in reality, which is why Wizards should definitely not sue them. I seriously doubt they're going to take any type of legal action because they don't need more bad press right now. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the deck, and I will see you guys next video.